Yeah, that sounds good. So, did you have a chance to look over? So basically, like to catch people who are watching up, um, where I'm at right now, or at least where I was at last night. I also read up on or reread some other literature that I'd like to talk about a little bit and get your thoughts on. But like, what are your thoughts on like Julia Serrano and like her idea of like gender as internal inclinations?
Yeah, so I think well, let me just say one thing about it.
Okay.
I certainly think it's an improvement over pure gender essentialism, essentialist views of gender, or pure social constructivism. So
Okay.
I think she's capturing more of what we mean when we talk about gender than the views that she sought out to provide an alternative for.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think she provided something that was a step in the right direction. Um, so and it's not that far off from my view.
Mm-hmm.
It's not completely my view, but my view, yeah, most of the characteristics that are part of the cluster concept of my understanding of gender are going to be mental characteristics. They're going to be not far off of what she calls internal inclinations.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, just like we have inclinations based around our sexual orientation, inclinations based around our um, various desires, we have inclinations that can be mapped onto our gender. Sure, yeah, I completely agree. Um, and most of the things that I think do map onto gender are things that are going to be mental characteristics. You can call them inclinations. You can call them desire. I sometimes call them desires,
Mm-hmm.
um, goals. Whether it's the desire to look a certain way, to dress a certain way, to be treated by society in a certain way. These are all going to be mental characteristics that are going to be um, archetypical of one archetypical of a male or archetypical of a female, and they're going to have certain differences on average.
Mm-hmm.
And you can construct a view of gender based on some archetypical nature of what someone would want to have in all of these mental characteristics, or what all these mental characteristics cash out into. Um, so you can have so you could break down each mental characteristic, and you could give it a certain weight for all the internal inclinations.
Hmm.
And there's going to be certain internal inclinations that are going to be very. Some inclinations could be weighted more than the other. So you can weight inclinations for society to treat you a given way more than whether you have an inclination of wearing a dress or not. You don't have to have that weighting, but you can if you want to. You could set it up any way you like. And to the degree that they all weigh out, there's going to be some one end you can have what the archetypical male would have. To another end, you could have what an archetypical female would have. There could be some vague predicate with no fact of the matter, so, and you can cash that out as non-binary. Um, and yeah, you can make all of that work.
Hmm.
And that's definitely a step ahead of and make it work, I mean classify individuals based on that as man, woman, non-binary, and so yeah, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
For those unfamiliar, it's a cluster concept. A cluster concept is where the it's something that is made of multiple different things. There's weighted lists of criteria, and no one criteria is necessary or sufficient for a given membership. Um, Democracy is known as a cluster concept.
Hmm.
The point. So yeah, I mean, so for example, this would be an example of a cluster concept. So you can say, well, the internal inclination to wear a dress is not necessary, nor is it sufficient to be a woman. Someone can be a woman without having the desire to wear a dress, and so it's not necessary. It's also not sufficient, because if someone does not have the desire to wear a dress, it's still the case that they can be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
However, it could also be the case, even though it's not necessary or sufficient for someone to be a woman to wear a dress, it could also still be the case that having some desire to wear a dress can somewhat, to some degree, count in favor of being a woman and push one closer on that spectrum toward the more feminine side. So it's compatible with not being necessary nor sufficient. Same thing is true for wanting to be treated in a more gentle way. Same is true for wanting to look a certain way. All of these internal inclinations can be neither necessary nor sufficient, however, can count in favor of being a certain gender or another gender.
Okay.
Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, and I think that like tracks with my understanding of internal inclination theory. I guess that and I mean, like, I've talked with several people now, and I guess that there are a couple like issues that I just need to like think through and talk through. Or maybe they're not issues at all. Maybe they're just me misunderstanding the relevant concepts. But
if you
like,
mean there are issues with the theory, I agree. There are issues with the theory. If that's what you mean.
I think.
Okay.
Let me ask you this: are you familiar with Oh God, everyone had been bringing up like Wittgenstein, but like not actually explaining what Wittgenstein talks about. But like, are you familiar with like any of Wittgenstein's work, or like prototype or exemplar theory? Because I've been trying to read more about that lately.
Not in depth. I've heard it brought up. I've like this. I mean, I've heard of some. I've been more familiar with other forms of Wittgenstein's work. When it came to other areas of philosophy, like what people bring up when they bring up rule following arguments, and but that's not what I suspect. That's not the type of area that they're gonna bring up for this concept. But you can walk me through what specific area that Wittgenstein contributed to philosophy, and like what it has to do with this.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of
like a pair or something, or some like general idea, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or at least the idea. I'm trying to think of a good way to be able to talk about the idea. I mean, it has to do with like a different way to be able to think about social constructs. There's a particular author who elaborates on this and who specifically focuses on writing about prototype theory, which is basically the idea that like it looks at concepts. It's a slightly different framing. It's criticized in a lot of philosophical literature, or seems to be criticized, because it doesn't focus on defining things by necessary and sufficient criteria, but it tries to focus more on how people come to learn terms and then go from there. And one time in one of Natalie's videos, she made like a small passing comment that like sometimes there are questions that need to be dissolved rather than resolved, and everyone took that and ran a mile to basically mean like, oh, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, which is not what Wittgenstein says. Like people took that to run a mile, but basically the idea is that like when you have or like when we're very young and we're taught what these concepts are to begin with, right? Usually, I say usually, and probably about 99.999 so on percent of cases, people don't learn about subjects from, like learning what they are definitionally and building out from there, right? It seems to be the case that they would argue, Wittgenstein people in this area, that people primarily learn about these concepts experientially. And in their head kind of build up this idea of like what the ideal of, sorry, I'm still hearing feedback. What the ideal of like this concept, whatever it is, and then measures everything else in society relative to like what the ideal is in their head. So like, a lot of people post this. I don't know. Someone might post in chat like the Giga Chad meme, where it's just like the giant, like the massive chin, massive muscles, right?
It's funny. I was gonna bring I have some pictures loaded up of Giga Chad ready for this conversation as well.
If you want to drop those into the, if you want to drop those into the live chat,
I'll drop it when they're ready. I think you're talking about family resemblance. Is that what you're getting at?
Kind of. So it gets at the idea that basically instead of trying, so like this alternative, instead of trying to find like some sufficient or necessary criteria for defining exactly what a woman, a man, or so on is, it basically acknowledges that like, all right, there are certain concepts that we all kind of understand, but which are largely, and this is kind of goes back to language I've used before, kind of goes back to like, we all have this individual but overlapping understanding of what concepts mean in society based on how we experience them. And we can probably make reasonable appeals to how the average reasonable person understands these concepts. And wherever the overlap is, that's probably what the socially constructed meaning of that term is, right? So like everyone in society has like like when you ask someone like what a woman is, they are very likely instinctively going to have like some image in their mind, whatever it may be. And it's not going to be the same image for everyone. I'm kind of referencing like Wittgenstein's beetle in the box idea, right? Basically, it's this idea that everyone can like understand a concept on their own, but because we can't read other people's mind, we can't know what their interpretation of this concept is, but we're able to glean some meaning from like what we're able to share with each other about our shared understanding of that concept is. Similar ideas exist for things like pain, right? Or love, where it's like we can't know exactly what someone else is feeling or what exactly is going on in someone else's mind or understanding of a certain concept. But because we all feel this thing or we all have an experience with this thing, then we can generally describe to each other what it is and glean some meaning from the shared overlap. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like family resemblance. So I'm not an expert on Wittgenstein, but I do know he's made the case that instead of asking for sets of necessary and sufficient properties to define things, that some concepts apply by virtue of something called family resemblance, which is an open-ended set of identifying features, and not all of the features need to be instantiated for the concept to apply. There are candidates like language, game, number, that he's used for this. So it sounds like you're talking about family resemblance, if not, which is fine. I mean, you don't. I actually have have agreement on this. My own notion of gender doesn't. I don't think it actually has any necessary or sufficient criteria, at least in principle. I'll also point out that if someone's going to define gender by in a way that comports with Wittgenstein's family resemblance, as opposed to necessary or sufficient properties, if they're going to divorce themselves from necessary or sufficient properties, it's not going to be self-ID. Because self-ID is taken to be, at least on the versions I've heard, a sufficient criteria. That if you self-ID a given gender, you are that gender.
Yeah. My understanding, well, I mean, it kind of goes to, sorry, I was distracted by my chat. My understanding, I mean, it reminds me of kind of like, this understanding. I know that I'd brought it up before, because I'm involved in the law and this is how I process ideas, right? And I know that people hate using this terminology, so I'm trying to not use this terminology, but like this idea of like looking at sort of like the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity is I'm using it very specifically referring to like how the average reasonable person in society understands a thing to be. Where it's like we're not looking for like a single individual quality of a person to say that they fit into this category or not. But essentially we're saying like, if we take like a sample of people who we assume to be a relative or a representative sample of whatever group we're looking at, and we ask them all to determine like, all right, do you think based on your understanding of gender that this, like, they just, you know, we can just like show them a picture of any person. We ask them like, is this person a woman? And they just, based on their personal understandings of that concept, come to the conclusion that they are or are not. I don't think that they're appealing to sufficient, like they could appeal to sufficient or necessary criteria, but I don't think that they have to, you know? It's just kind of like everyone's trying to figure out like, where's the overlap between their individual ideas that they have in their head for like the prototypical woman or similar genders.
Yeah, and what I think we're trying to do here is we're trying to come up with a definition which does not have to have necessary or sufficient criteria. So it's not, and even chairs can be defined this way. Although people can get into that if they want to go down the Wittgenstein rabbit hole. But you can, there's not going to be any single, or at least it doesn't seem to be any single necessary sufficient criteria for defining a chair. There could always be some sort of weird example of a chair that does or doesn't have something. But there are certain things that may count in favor of something being a chair. So no, there could be an example of a chair that doesn't have a footrest, but hey, if there's a footrest, maybe that counts in a little bit of favor. Having an armrest, not every chair will have an armrest. Not every chair will have four things. That's, you know, it will be, not every chair will be on 4 legs. Some may be on 3 legs. But we have this general idea, general notion, and there are certain characteristics that push it in favor of overlapping with that general notion. So the way I see it is that just like with a chair, there's going to be certain characteristics which can move it away from the general notion and toward the periphery of the general notion. And eventually, at some point, I don't know when it will be, but eventually at some point to something that we don't recognize as a chair. So that can be changed by changing the propositions.
Yeah.
The same thing, I view the same thing as true of gender. There are certain characteristics that you can change of a given individual that will change how it maps onto the average understanding of a given gender. They may still conclude that they're a given gender, but it would take more work for them to do so. It wouldn't be as easy. And eventually, at some point, they wouldn't do it at all if you change enough characteristics. Especially when you include characteristics.
Yeah. I think that, like, especially like with the chair, I feel like, so kind of looking at the appeal of the kind of framework that we're talking about, I think that people have a much easier or a much harder time trying to like answer the question, what is a chair? But a much easier time answering the question, what's your idea of a chair? Right? And I think that there's like value. I think that there's value that we can. I was just saying that like there's value that we can probably like elicit from the fact that people have a like the fact that because we can understand that this thing is socially constructed, that it necessarily is going like that seems to logically follow that like everyone is going to have a slightly different understanding of it, but we can still make, but in order to make some kind of appeal to the overlap in people's ideas of this subject, then, you know, it might be better to try and make an appeal to the overlap rather than asking people to define like specific criteria, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, you may not, there in many cases of definitions where you have such a common domain overlap, you don't really have to do the work like that. You don't have to ask people give me your criteria. There's like this common overlap. The areas where you do is when you're engaged in a different goal. So the goal could be, well, I just have the goal of having a definition of the thing I'm talking about. If you have that goal, then sure, that is some work you'll have to do. Another case is if you want to define things on the periphery of the concept. So if you for some reason were very interested in looking at the periphery of the general concept where it's no longer clear and it's no longer obvious whether there's overlap or not. There may or may not be.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, you may want, if you had some goal to analyze whether you would consider it, what you would consider it, then yeah, that you would have more work to do to flesh out your definition. One thing I'll briefly just touch on, because some people have brought up, like when in the chair example, like, well, a necessary criteria, not a sufficient criteria, but a necessary criteria for a chair is that you can sit in it. That might sound, that's not true either. Like, for example, let's just say I took a plain old chair. Just think of a chair, the most obvious chair that's a chair. And let's just say it was like in a spirit realm or whatever, that like you tried to sit in it, you just fell right through it, right? And let's just say there were no spirits that could sit in the chair or whatever, in this weird hypothetical. So you see this chair and you try to sit in it, you just fall right through the chair. You can't sit in the chair. However, you still consider it a chair. So even the property of being able to sit in the chair is not a necessary, nor is it sufficient, by the way, criteria for being a chair.
Sure, but I would say that, like, I would say that, like, in that example, because in that case, like, you know, and again, I'm trying to just be like descriptive here, thinking like what's going through someone's head probably as they're like making that classification, like calling it a chair. Like, what I think is going on inside people's heads, and people can tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is accurate, or at least this is my experience, and people can tell me if they agree with this or not, is that like what would happen is I would look at the thing and I would probably understand it to be a chair because I'm measuring against some idea I have in my head of what a chair already is, right? Like I have somewhere stored in my noggin, like a file that says chair, and there's like I'm thinking like standard 4 wooden pegs and a seat and a wooden back, you know? And maybe there's some other examples I have in my head too. You know, I've lived 24 going on 25 years of life. I've seen a decent amount of chairs, but I'm probably like measuring what I'm seeing, the spirit chair, against all of those and kind of making the immediate assumption like, oh, or the immediate conclusion like, okay, this matches against my experience of chair, right? I think that's what's sort of happening, right? Even if I can't sit in it personally.
Right. And then the interesting thing here, so aside from there being no necessary or sufficient criteria, at least that we know of for this chair, the point, both in terms of these, just like the criteria, for a similar reason that there's not going to be a necessary or sufficient criteria, our general concept of chair is generally shared in the non-peripheral areas of it. But in the peripheral areas of it, things get more tricky. And so the point here is just that if someone, for whatever reason, wanted to have a actual definition they can refer to of a chair, what they can go through is the exercise of trying to capture the different characteristics that make things more chair-like or make things less chair-like, or count in favor of being a chair and count away from being a chair. And they can generate that cluster concept with its various weightings. So, yeah, I mean that's the basic idea with that I take with gender, and I think that's a very similar approach that I think that's also a very similar approach that Julia Serrano's internal inclination theory is taking. My issue with it is just that I'm not too convinced that the only characteristics that count in favor of being a given gender versus any other given gender are going to all boil down to internal inclinations, to that being the only characteristics. And if anything's not an internal inclination characteristic, then it absolutely cannot. It just can't count in favor of being a given gender or another. This is not to say that the internal inclination theory of gender is denying that things cause these internal inclinations that are like biological or whatnot. She actually has gotten quite a bit of flack and accusations of being an essentialist, for simply acknowledging that biology can come into play for these desires. But the point of contention here is if what is meant here is that the only thing that matters with respect to being counting in favor or against being within that general concept of a given gender rather than any other given gender, that may seem a little bit contentious, and we can go through some examples, and this is where I can load up some of the memes.
Oh yeah, no, here, lay it on me, because I'm interested in kind of like your examples of like I'm interested in some examples of what you're talking about. So yeah, go ahead, bring it on.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's say, so here's example one, right? So let's just say that we have this individual who has, among the spectrum of different internal inclinations, or desires, whatever mental characteristics we have, they have leaning woman internal inclinations.
Okay. So
they're not all the way on the extreme end of like being, some of their internal desires may be more masculine.
Sure.
But on the net, they lean a bit toward women.
Okay.
Now let's say this individual. Okay, so let's say like on a scale of negative 100, positive 100, they lean like minus 15, and let's say that just arbitrarily the negative direction is in the woman direction.
Okay.
All right. Now let's say this individual looks like this. I'm posting it in the stream chat. Okay.
Hello there. Oh, that person looks familiar.
Yeah. Now let's say, okay, so now do we say that this individual is a woman? I would say so.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah. All right. Okay, now, same story. We have a person with the same net of inclinations, and they lean a little bit, not heavily, but just they lean mildly to the same degree on the negative 15 scale of their internal inclinations. And that person happens to look like this. I'm posting in stream chat.
Oh, they have the same internal inclinations, but
yeah,
they look like this.
Yeah. And their internal inclinations is just like ever so slightly. We don't even have to go negative 15. Like, let's say they both had like -1 or -2. Like the internal inclinations ever so slightly lean feminine. And that's how they look. Right? Now, is this person a woman? Now, you may say yes and you may say no. But regardless of whether you say yes or no to that question, it seems like you're not going to have as much of an easy time of saying this person is a woman as the first example I picked. And it seems like a lot of people aren't going to have as easy of a time saying they're a woman, even if they end up concluding that this individual is a woman.
Now,
does that make sense?
It does. Let me ask you, because we had this conversation a while ago. I used to focus on, and I'm trying to figure out like a good framing for this, because I feel like there's still utility, right? Like talking about, for example, like we could assume this person is like the closeted trans woman. Like, I don't know. We'll bring anecdotes into this, because I don't know if you have seen pictures of me, but I used to be a college football player, and now I am not.
Yeah.
A lot has happened between then and now.
Yep.
But like, you know, I've known I've trans for like the longest time. And one of the biggest things that kept me from coming out was pressure to my family, to try and live up to this model of like what I thought that they wanted me to be. Like there are a lot of things externally that kept me from coming out, but like that was how I presented to the world. Right. And so like there is nuance to capture that, like, while that person may not look in the same, it may not like physically match how the average reasonable person would think of their example of what a woman is in their mind. But like there's still something there to appeal to, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. And just to be clear, this isn't to say that physical characteristics can count in favor of a given gender or another. Isn't to say that physical characteristics, any one of them, or even a collection of them, can be a necessary or sufficient criteria. So it's not to say that if someone looks like Giga Chad, that it's impossible for them to be a woman. If there are other characteristics, if their internal inclinations leaned heavily enough to the woman category, at some point, I think even I would consider someone a woman if they look like that. So it's not to say that's on my view. So it's not to say that a person's appearance precludes them. It's just to say that it's part of the equation. That's all. And it clearly is, because well, there's many reasons for us to think that. The first example right here is just that if we equalize all the other mental characteristics between this Blair White looking individual and the Giga Chad looking individual, if we equalize all the mental characteristics, they're just slightly leaning toward feminine. The $1 million question is, are you going to have just as easy of a time as saying this Blair White looking individual is a woman as this Giga Chad individual is a woman? If the answer is yes, fair enough. You can have a consistent position where gender is completely constructed based on mental characteristics. But I don't think that captures what just about anyone, if not everyone, is thinking when they think about a given gender. That these characteristics are just divorced from counting in favor or against.
No, I agree. Well, I mean, this is kind of why I tried to make the appeal. I don't know. I feel like I'm roping back to this, and people just got mad that I use this terminology. But like, I keep believing that this captures the nuance, right? That basically we can have like a reasonable distinction. Again, this is the language I'm using. You don't have to use this language. It's just the language I find to be the most useful at the moment. Or instead of subjective and objective, we could also use like maybe psychology or like gender orientation or other terms that seem to kind of capture what we're meaning. But like we could say that someone is like, I'm just going to use subjectively and objectively, and I'm going to ask that people try to understand what I'm saying right now. We could say that someone is like subjectively a woman, right? Like they have this psychology which predisposes them towards these internal inclinations. But also at the same time that they're not seen by the average reasonable person in society as consistent with the gender that they psychologically are. And we can be able to capture nuance there, right?
Of course, just with any cluster concept. I can't stress it enough. Like this is not because it's weird. Because like I'm not saying you're definitely not doing this, but you tell this to some people and they'll be like, oh my gosh, you're true scum. Like you're just, it's passing. That's what it is for you. Like no, it's just it's not at all. It's just this. It's kind of the same response that it's really not far off from the same response that Julia Serrano has gotten from her internal inclination theory, the criticism just by acknowledging that biology may play a role in our internal inclinations. It's not to say that you're precluded from being trans if you look cis. That's not what followed on The View.
Yeah.
It's just to say that all else considered equal, an appearance, especially if pronounced enough, can count in favor or against for a given gender. It's not to say that it precludes anyone. It's not to say that it necessarily includes anyone. It's just to say that it's just a cluster concept, and part of the cluster are non-mental characteristics. Now, most of the weighting in my system is going to be mental characteristics. I put most of the weighting on mental characteristics.
I agree.
I do put a small amount of weighting on, but not most, but a small amount, but not none, on the non-mental characteristics, because my goal here is to capture. My goal in setting up some definition is to capture what people mean when they use this word. And I'm not I'm talking about a subset of people who use gendered terminology that understand that gender is different from sex. I'm trying to capture what they mean when they use that term.
Yeah.
And again, like it also does a good job, I think, although there may be some underdeterminations, of explaining why many trans people seek to change their non-mental characteristics.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's...
When we say
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, when we say things like gender-conforming surgery or gender-conforming therapies, majority of which are not dedicated to the mind.
Yeah.
They're dedicated to non-mental characteristics. And I mean, that it certainly may be possible that you're not changing yourself to conform to any gender any further, but yeah, of course, it's not about changing the mind.
Yeah, and I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, like...
I think Pixie had a question, actually. Like, if you wanted to have her hop in.
Oh, yeah, I just finished thought, and then, yeah, Pixie, you're free to hop in. Yeah. But just to, like, finish the thought, because, I mean, like, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because, like, weirdly enough, I don't know, I'm very public, obviously a, public figure, and I also just had bottom surgery. Hooray, awesome. And it's great, but also interesting, because, like, as far as my mental health, I am fantastic, right? Like, I feel like this is, like, I'm over the moon over as far as, like, recovery has been great. I'm basically on the tail end. I'm able to work out now again, which is awesome. Like, I'm in a really good spot in life as far as, like, my mental health. And so, but the thing that I'm trying to, like, kind of, like, self-psychoanalyze is trying to, like, figure out, okay, so, like, what exactly is going on in my head that makes it such that that since I got this gender-confirming surgery, that it increased my overall well-being, right? Because, I mean, like, it's a very similar feeling to, like, when you experience something like pain or something like love, it's like, you know that you're experiencing a feeling, but it's very hard to quantify, like, how much or why, right? You just know that you experience it, and you're trying to, like, figure out what's going on inside your head from after. And so here, it's like, it very obviously isn't just all social, and there's some inclinations I'm appealing to here. And I think that, like, and so this is kind of what brings me back to, like, this idea of, like, this is what got me thinking more about this idea of, like, Wittgenstein and, like, the beetle in the box analogy, which we can talk about more later after Pixie has her question. But it's this idea that, like, basically everyone has this idea in their head. Or we talked about it earlier, right? So I guess it's kind of like me striving towards, like, I have these internal inclinations towards woman. I have this idea of what woman is in my head, so I strive towards it, right? And that makes me, that satisfies some internal inclinations.
Now, let me ask you this question, because some people may say that, well, the reason people want to change their physical characteristics are simply because they have, they want to behave or express themselves in society. They want to actualize some certain societal norms a certain way, and that characteristic is still mental. And then the reply, or at least one reply to that, is, what if you were
like on a desert island all by yourself?
Yeah, exactly. So what if you were not in a society? Yeah, what if you were divorced from society? So if you were in any if you were to change your physical characteristics, you wouldn't actually be gaining anything in terms of your behavior with society or your societal expression or the way society recognized you in any way. And the $1 million question here is, would you still, if you were on this desert island, would you still have this desire to change your physical characteristics? Would that still make you feel better? If you just had a desert island with a mirror?
Yeah, I mean, like, my honest answer is probably yes. It's hard to understand exactly, like, what and I'm still trying to, like, psychoanalyze and figure out, like, this is the reason why I'm thinking about this a lot lately, right? Is that, like, this is, like, these are inclinations I've been appealing to since, like, as young as fucking I can remember, right? Excuse my language, sorry. But, like, from as young as I could recall, I have always been able to have, like, actually, I should say this. From as young as I could, like, understand what a woman is, or, like as young as I began, like, developing this idea of what a woman is, I was able to look at that and be like, that is the category that I best associate with. So I guess it's hard, right? Because, like, if I if I never was able to develop an understanding of that concept to begin with, it could have been the case that I did have inclinations towards manifesting myself in such a way where I would be otherwise in society categorized as woman that I would never have acted on and that may have never known about. But I feel like those inclinations would still be there because basically as soon as I started learning like what this concept was, I immediately snapped into, okay, that's best representative of who I am. Does that make sense? Like it's kind of like,
and this is,
or sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a really key point. Like when people say this is why I asked the island example a lot. It gets to something really core because it's really good about teasing out if something is just the only thing people are caring about. And it seems very clear that a motivating factor for at least a lot of trans people in getting gender confirmation therapies aimed at their physical attributes is not just for social interaction. It's not just for how they express themselves in society. It's not just for how they are looked at in society. They could just be completely divorced of society, and they would still be driven to change their physical characteristics. And it's possible you could just have some mental desire that there's no further fact of the matter that has nothing to do with gender, and then you could have a consistent view of gender such that it doesn't actually count any in favor of you being one gender versus the other. It's just that you have a desire to look that way, and that desire is what is making the gender there. That's certainly consistent. That's fine. Then the next question that I'd ask then. So now that we've wandered away the society explanation is explaining all of it. Here's $1 million question that you may have been asked. In fact, I'm probably sure you have been asked before. Compared to where you were before you transitioned. So imagine yourself completely in as Giga Chad as you were.
I hate it. Yeah, that's like the irony. I'm sorry. You can obviously finish the question, but it's weird looking back because when I before transition, I never thought of myself as this person, but it's weird looking back and I can recognize holy shit. Yeah, I don't know. That's just a weird, I guess, dysphoria thing, but whatever. But yeah, go ahead.
Now here's the question. In your mind, if you compare yourself in terms of your keeping all the mental characteristics the same. So let's say you had all the mental characteristics you did in Giga Chad RGR as you do in current RGR.
Amazing.
And the only thing we're looking at is the physical differences. Would you say that right now you are more of a woman, or you are more easily identified? Well, more, yeah. But let's just take that before we.
Yeah. So I mean,
clarifying that question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that and this is kind of why I find the most utility between differentiating whatever we want to call this. Right now I'm just going to use objectivity and subjectivity just because if we want to differentiate between social gender and psychological gender, I would say that I was a woman in respect to the former, but probably not the latter because I hadn't manifested that. It was still in a way sort of how would we put it? Theoretical. It was. Natalie said this in her aesthetic video, and she got a lot of flack for it, but I feel like it kind of captures the same idea. There's a real experience of a trans person who is pre-transition that is real and acknowledgeable, right? It is a very real experience, right? But to say that they just are in every respect the gender that they identify with before transition seems to mean that there's no reason that they would want to transition in the first place, For me, I wouldn't be satisfied. There's a meme that goes around on the internet where essentially what it says is there's a genie wish kind of meme where it's grant or you have one wish and it can be anything you ask for, and then the person is make me into a girl, and then the genie claps and it says it is done, and then the person looks down and is nothing changed, and the genie is exactly. And then there's a pause, and then the person is like, okay, but listen here, you little shit. Where it's like, yes, in certain respects, we can acknowledge that, like, the person that, like, I have always been a woman in certain respects, but, like, in others, there's clearly things that I am striving towards, There's a reason that I pursue medical transition, and just being told by people online, oh, you're already a woman, isn't satisfying to me in that respect,
Okay, so there's so there's that's one approach you can take. So one approach you can take is to just disambiguate and separate gender into different types of gender. So you can say, well, we'll go away from the social aspect, because I can ask the same question on an island. If you were more of a woman now than if you were before. So we can say, with respect to physical gender or something like that, you would be more of a woman with respect to physical gender. However, you may not be more of a woman with respect to mental characteristic gender or something like that.
I think we should. Sorry to interject. We should stay away from the word physical, because it sounds more like it's referring to like biological sex as opposed to the kind of social expression. So physical manifestation of gender is like clothes and stuff.
What kind?
Well, the thing is,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm asking the question in the context of an island, so it's whatever we call it, it's not going to be social, at least in that context, because there's no one else to socialize with, unless you consider socializing with yourself. So I'm just divorcing the whole social concept away to see if there's any sort of valuation that maps onto gender that's just not social.
Performed?
No, not even performed, because I can wind that away too, and I can say, well, let's say you're just paralyzed. All things considered equal, you're paralyzed in front of a mirror. You're not able to perform anything. Would you be happier if you looked a given way versus not a given way? And I think some people would say yes. I'd be happier. Like, yeah, it would suck that I'm just paralyzed on an island. There's no social. I can't perform anything. There's no gender performative theory here. But yeah, I just value the way I look, especially now that the damn mirror is in front of me all the fucking time, Like, so I'm sure that there are people who would say something like that. So that's the kind of thing I'm getting at. I'm trying to just wand away all of the different considerations that may be brought in to try to shield the fact that some people may care about non-mental characteristics. Because a lot of people, not saying you or anyone else, but a lot of people get really hesitant to say that, because they're afraid that people might misrepresent their position. They may call them things like true scum, or they may call them, they may say their criteria is just by passing or things like that. For various different reasons, people seem hesitant to do that, and what I'm trying to do is force the uncomfortable conversation.
Well, I guess, all right,
which may or may not be uncomfortable. Go ahead.
Well, this is what I can give to people who are, like, concerned, right? Because this is what happened when the whole Demon Mama thing first came around originally. And Pixie and I actually had the conversation about this, where I think that the utility provided by acknowledging this socially constructed aspect of gender, which I think that most people... I think that the reason why a lot of people probably want to not talk about it is if there's a chance that might be used, like you said, to, like, try and invalidate them. And that's not what we're trying to do, right? But, like, because when we're looking at kind of this, what people's ideas are and whether or not you're meeting people's ideas of what a woman is, those are constructed and those can be changed over time, right? Like, if we were to ask 12 people in society generally what constitutes a woman for them, or what their idea of a woman is, versus, like, 12 people in a super progressive, trans-inclusive, friendly Discord, you're going to get very different answers, right? And so the idea for me is to basically just try and move society more to be like Discord, where what is the average reasonable person's understanding of a woman? Well, it's going to be probably almost solely focused on just, like, what pronoun role you pick up, which seems to be how it works in a lot of cases, right? People pick up a pronoun role, and that pretty much indicates to everyone, like, okay, this person uses these pronouns, that probably means they are this so-and-so gender, and that these carry like so-and-so ways to interact with this person. And so like,
So if I may, yeah. So I agree with all that, but I want to point out that that's talking about a different kind of thing here. So there's going to be I'm going to use there's some philosophy words. So I'm going to use and I'm sure people are familiar with it, but I'm separating the separation I'm creating here is going to be ontological versus epistemic. So the ontologic is just going to be the questions like what is woman, what is man, what are these things. Epistemic is how we go about figuring out whether someone is a woman or someone is a man. And the question I'm posing is not the how we go about figuring out question. And I agree. I'll just say right now that nothing turns on in terms of being inclusive or not inclusive in the epistemic context, because the reason is because we don't have mind reading technology. And so since we don't have mind reading technology, and on my interpretation of gender at least, most of the weighting is on mental characteristics. When someone says they're a given gender, regardless of how I ontically cash out gender, when someone says they're given gender, epistemically, I'm just going to take them at their word.
Right.
Unless I have like extremely strong reason to do otherwise. There are some cases where there's extremely strong reason to do otherwise, and I think everyone can agree on that. Like, for example, if someone has a schizophrenic episode, if someone who is trans hits their head and becomes amnesic and then identifies as cis, for example. Like, there are some really weird cases like that where in that case...
Or I was going to say, like, the easier example is, like, y'all remember when Steven Crowder tried to pretend to be a trans woman and, like, went into a bunch of what was it, like, workout stations to try and, like, specifically try to, like, bully those people for being trans inclusive?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I feel like that's another example, too. But, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just, like, that was the first thing I thought of.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, unless there's, like, unless there's really strong reason to think that the individual is straight up lying, or that they may not be lying, but they're just obviously mistaken. So the straight up lying is going to be the Steven Crowder example, where it's like, okay, yes, it is the case that they're identifying as a gender that is opposite their sex. We're not going to consider them that gender because we have strong reason to believe that they're actually just straight up lying. The other example is if we have reason to believe that they're actually straight up mistaken. And these are rare. Like, one example would be is if someone has a schizophrenic episode, or if someone, for example, if you were to trip and hit your head and then you had amnesia and then you identified as a man, because you couldn't remember your transition or anything. Like I may, I don't know how handling that would be a whole thing in and of itself, but would I believe that you were a man? And the answer is no, I wouldn't, because I would know that that's just a product of your amnesia. But for the overwhelming majority of cases where you just meet someone and they say that they're a woman or a man, you're just going to take them at their word. That's what I'm just going to take them at their word, because I don't have mind reading technology. And if I did, and I had some brain scan and it told me you were lying, then I would change my view. I would say, oh, turns out you are doing a Steven Crowder. I had no idea. Or something like that. But because we don't have that technology, the epistemic question is just a completely different question. The question I'm interested in, and so the answer to the epistemic question is just like, as a general heuristic, just take people at their word. What I'm talking about here is the ontological question. The ontological question is, okay, well, we may not have all the epistemic tools to figure out if someone is a man or a woman, so we're not going to exclude or include anyone, but this is just a conversation on what these things are. You appreciate the difference between those two things?
Yeah, I do. I guess that, like, I do think that I was talking about the ontological, but, like, to try and be, like, more specific about, like, how I was. So, like, if we're taking the kind of view of gender where there's no sufficient or necessary criteria, and where we're focusing on, let's say like a prototype exemplar theory kind of approach where we're defining gender ontologically largely based off of, you know, the rough overlap in the average reasonable person's understanding of what this concept means to them in society, right? Like that's kind of where that whatever meaning is in that overlap between the average reasonable person's understanding of like what their idea of like a woman would be. Like if we're taking the view that that's what we're meaning when we say gender, then that's something which can be changed over time, right? And which has changed over time, you know? Like I'm sure if we were to take people from like 100 years ago in America and ask them what their idea of a woman is, or if we could like scan their brain and like, you know, we ask them like, think of what a woman is, and they like think of some archetypal woman, it's going to be very different from if we scan the brains of people who live nowadays and we ask that same question, right? Sure. And so that's sort of what I'm talking more about, right? Is that like, given that these are things which can change over time, the goal should probably be, if we want to be like if we want to try like, if we want to, a goal that we could have based on this idea is to like try and over time expand this idea to make it more inclusive of people, so that if there are people, like we could even like push it super far, right? This is like, I believe like a gender abolitionist sort of view, where it's like, if we had someone like the Giga Chad trans woman, the kind of example that you brought up earlier, right? We probably want to, as a prescriptive matter, make it as easy as possible for those people to be treated in the ways that they want to, according to the inclinations that would make them categorized as women in society, and to try and over time erode away as many barriers to that as possible, is kind of the idea, right? Given that I'm making an appeal to an idea that is socially constructed, it probably would be good to like try and over time move the idea. And this is kind of the idea of like, there are people who use this term like very disparagingly, but I try to use it more endearingly. This is kind of what trans activists do, right? When you have people go out, there are plenty of examples of this that like Rosa Dawn and people like her always bring up, right? Like the women with beards or whatever, right? They tout these people as like freaks, but I mean like there are a lot of people who would be treated as freaks if we go back like 50 to 100 years ago that are completely mainstreamed in society nowadays just by virtue of being present and accepted, you know? And I feel like we could probably do the same thing with gender, in expanding like that, our ideas of what gender are.
No, yeah, and that's all fine and good. You can do that. There are ways to do that epistemically, and there are ways to do that ontologically. But regardless of what you come out with, the uncomfortable question still remains, and I'll be the unfortunate individual to keep circling back to it.
You're all good.
So even if we do broaden the scope, the question's just going to remain: do physical characteristics change where a person lies, or can change where a person lies in that family resemblance concept? Can it change them from being closer to the periphery or closer to the center of the family resemblance concept?
Right.
In other words, do physical characteristics change, or not? Even if they don't change the gender, do they move a person along that gender axis? Can they do that in any way?
So I think that there are two answers that at least I can think of to this off the top of my head. You could either take the approach that you don't have any delineation between what is mental and what is physical or like societally observed, in which case you could just say that like someone is mentally a woman or psychologically a woman or subjectively a woman, but then may objectively or societally or physically not be in certain respects, right? You could either take the approach which delineates the two. I feel like that's probably the easiest way to go. Or I don't know. That seems to be more satisfying to me than to just lumping it all together and saying like you're just a little bit back further on the sliding scale of gender. So you're not quite at woman, but you're at this weird in-between phase. Because we probably wouldn't categorize them as man either.
You may not have to say, so it doesn't commit you to saying they're in a in-between phase. You can set up it such that like they're still going. In fact, you can set up it such that regardless of physical characteristics, that they're still going to be a woman. Regardless, it's just that they're not going to fall. They're just going to be more on the, that periphery of the family resemblance understanding. So it doesn't necessarily have to turn on whether you're going to conclude, even if you had all the epistemic data or the empirical facts, even if you had all of that, you may not have to make it turn on whether your dichotomy of or categorization of a continuous variable will turn on it. So you can say, well, even regardless of whether you look like Blair White or Giga Chad, I'm going to be based on your internal characteristics. I'll conclude that you're a woman. But then the question is just going to be, does it change where they are on that masculinity femininity spectrum? So you could be a woman and be more in the center of what people understand or commonly understand of what a woman is, whether we're talking about average society, whether we're talking about progressive discord. And you could be a woman and be closer to the periphery. And so the question comes back again, even if we want to make the most inclusive ontic definition, can physical characteristics change where someone is from being in the center to being closer to the periphery?
I mean, the answer is again, like, if we want to take the view that, like,
yeah. Okay, I'll say it because I know it's very uncomfortable. I'm just gonna say it. Yeah, the answer is yes. Like, it can. Like, it trivially can. At least I think so. I mean, it just demonstrated by, like, it. Even if you look at Giga Chad and say Giga Chad I'll consider this version of Giga Chad a woman. There seemed to be more pause. There seemed to be more hesitation in calling this version of Giga Chad a woman. And there's this weird feeling of guilt some people have when they look at that and when they realize and reflect that that's what happened. I'm here to dispel that guilt. Like, that's actually okay. Like, you can say, okay, this may have, there are certain characteristics that struck me the other way, but hey, if you say you're a woman, go for it. I'm just epistemically go ahead. That's fine. I don't see a problem with that. Like, it doesn't change the inclusivity. It doesn't. Nothing turns on it epistemically, certainly. And yeah, and you're really okay. And yes, physical characteristics can change where someone is on the family resemblance, of course, and it's like any other characteristic. You could change where someone lies on a family resemblance. Now, yeah, you can dichotomize it into, like, physical gender, and non-physical gender. You can do that too. It's still going, but even if you do that, and yeah, you can ask someone, well, would you say their physical gender, and you explain what you mean by physical gender, is a woman, and would you say their non-physical gender is a woman? What's going to happen then is the answers you're going to get you may be, so that's an approach you can take. You're going to get more you're going to get more polarizing answers with respect to the two different disambiguations. So which is fine. So someone would say, okay, well, this person is clearly, I know their mental characteristics. They're clearly a woman in the mental gender sense, and in the physical gender sense, they're clearly not a woman. Now, that may be more comfortable. That may be less comfortable for someone to hear, because some people may not want to hear that. So the disadvantage of separating the two, I'll just tell you right now, is some people may be very, it may be disutility. Some people may be very hurt by hearing something like, well, yeah, I'm a woman mentally, but you're saying in this sense of gender that I'm not a woman. Now, someone may be hurt with the other version too. They may be hurt by hearing themselves being viewed as, someone more on the periphery of the family resemblance understanding of being a woman. So which one wins out? Which one is what's going to hurt people more? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think maybe the first one. I'm not sure. But regardless, I'm not sure if I don't think people should be hurt by either of them, because they're just and here's the reasons. A, it doesn't turn on what we conclude. Nothing is going to change on it. We're not going to exclude anyone or include anyone on this process of like doing any of this, because we don't have brain scanners. So it's just and B, I think being able to respond to people who accuse transgender communities of not having coherent definitions, it's important to be able to respond by saying, oh yes, actually I do. Here's the cluster concept. Yes, this is totally fine. And what's the criticism? Instead of just saying, you know, the worst case scenario is like offering some self-referential self-ID definition, and not as bad, but still pretty bad, is offering a non-self-referential self-ID definition that has all these hilarious reductions. So, which you can do, which I acknowledge you can do without the physical characteristics, but then you're leaving open someone to dunk on you in a debate by saying like, oh, really? You think that, you know, all else equal, Giga Chad and Blair White have no difference in any gender concept? Like, it'll look really weird if you say like, no, there's no difference in any gender concept between if you equalize every other characteristic between Giga Chad and Blair White. Like, no, they're kind of looks like there is, but that's okay, because I've set it up in like my understanding of it is such that if I understand the internal characteristics, the mental characteristics, nothing may turn on it in terms of what I classify them as. That's a much better response, a more robust response, at least in my view.
Now I guess that makes sense. Well, here, let me ask you this, because some people, just on this, I don't think I disagree with you. One thing that you might get pushback on that in this respect is that some people might say, well, there's a distinction to be made. Like, we could say that they're both equally woman, but one is expressing femininity much more than the other person is. And they would try to draw that distinction, say that like, no, well, they are different in terms of, you know, one is expressing more femininity than the other person. But they would still both be equally woman. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that, but I mean, like, that's something I can imagine people saying to like that example, is that like this goes more to gender expression than they would use the term identity. We could make another appeal, but that's probably what they would use.
So yeah. So it depends what we mean when we say equally, both equally women. If by equally women we just mean that they both fall under the categorization of women, then yeah, I'll agree, they're both equally women. If by equally women we mean that based on our gender schema, they're both within the same degree of centricity of the family resemblance concept of woman, then I'm going to disagree. They're clearly not equally central in the family-wise resemblance. One is more on the periphery than the other. If what we mean on a cluster concept, and one of those characteristics, no matter how heavily weighted, are different, and expressing as a woman does push one. Femininity expression does push one more toward being a woman. If by equally woman we mean having the same result when we summate all the characteristics, I'm going to disagree. If by equally women we just mean having sufficient weighted characteristics such that they're a woman, I'm going to agree. It depends. So the answer is just to disambiguate what's meant by equally woman.
Okay. That's satisfying. Hey, Pixie, I'm not sure if you got to ask your question, but I'm sorry, we went on for a little bit longer than I think that we were.
Oh no, it's all good. Yeah, I'm just listening. Yeah, no, this is kind of where mainstream science is at, right? Where they just use the terms gender expression for the external physical, like what are you doing? What is your current like presented gender? And then gender identity, which is very poorly named. Not to mean whatever you're consciously identifying as, but just as that kind of mental state of being, right?
Yeah, I think gender identity is, I think the best use for, so here's what I'll say, self-ID is a good thing. So I'll say what it's not a good thing for. I think it's a very poor thing to be used to define gender. I think it's a terrible thing to be used to define gender, but I think it's a very good thing to proxy gender. I think self-ID is it's one of the best tools we have in society to be a social proxy, a way of communicating a proxy. And that's just what it is. It's a very strong correlate. There's always going to be some individuals who are lying. There's always going to be some individuals who are mistaken. However, and it's not going to work out as a definition for either being incoherent or having hilarious reductives, but it's a very, very good way of forming a heuristic to proxy what someone's actual gender is. And so that's great. In terms of gender expression, so gender expression, there's a little bit of nuance with gender expression that I just want to capture with. So here's my issue with that. So it's all fine and good. The bit of nuance that I want to also include are things that are non-mental, but also non-expressivist. So, so the example where someone's just completely paralyzed. Like, let's say someone has locked-in syndrome. It's a condition where all the muscles in their body are paralyzed except for except for certain eye muscles. But let's say those are paralyzed too. So this person really just can't take any action. They're just sort of a prisoner in their own body. A literal prisoner, actually. So let's just say we have this hypothetical where someone just really cannot engage in expression. It still seems like there are going to be some characteristics that do make a difference in terms of being more central to being more peripheral on the family resemblance of what woman is, for example. And those characteristics are not going to be expressivist characteristics, unless you want to define simple physical characteristics impliciter as expressivist, like you're just expressing how you look in virtue of how you look, for example, even if you can't perform any action. But I take it that's not what people generally mean when they. But go ahead, Pixel.
Aside from what would it be? Like the clothes that you are dressed up in without your consent because you're paralyzed, I don't see any other traits that would be considered gender at all. Unless we talk about the engendering of biological sex.
We can even wind away the clothes. Like, let's say someone is without clothes and they're completely paralyzed. The question is going to be, let's say this Blair White-looking individual is completely paralyzed, without any expressivist, no jewelry, no clothing, anything like that. They're on an island. There's no society. And then let's say we have Giga Chad, who does not have any clothing at all or anything like that. There's no society. They're on an island. Everything else is the same. The question is, do they both fall equally centric to the family resemblance concept of woman? That's the question. Or is one more peripheral, however it may be ever so slightly, than the other?
And the answer there would be to say that one of them is more peripheral than the other. Although because they have these internal inclinations, that we could say that they both can still be on this family resemblance web.
Yeah. So that's the $1 million question. $1 million question is, if we have that example, are they both equally central within that concept, or are they both well within the concept, but one might be somewhat more peripheral?
Yeah, of course one's more peripheral. That's how we break up gender identity and gender expression.
Yeah. So then the only point here is that I don't know if we will be expression in that case, because this is a case where the only thing that is making one more peripheral is not an expression. It's just a physical characteristic. They're not expressing.
So you're talking about engendering of physical sex? Or what trait are you saying here constitutes
not physical sex. It doesn't have to be.
What trait? Hair
it
length?
doesn't have to be. I'm sorry. What?
Hair length? What's the physical trait you're looking at?
It could be any of the. It could be the It could be whether it's the well-shaped beard that's archetypical of how males generally shape their beard. It could be the robust musculature. It could be all of these physical characteristics. It doesn't have to be sex. This Giga Chad, for example, could have ovaries and could produce large gametes, and could mother children. We can even in that example. So let's just equalize that. Let's say this Blair White-looking individual has ovaries and can mother children, produces large gametes. Giga Chad has ovaries, produces large gametes, can mother children. But then, what's the answer to the question then? They're both not expressing anything. They're both paralyzed. They're both clothingless. Is one more peripheral than the other? And if you say yes to that, then it would seem like certain non-expressivist physical characteristics can make one more peripheral. Trivially.
The only such characteristics that exist are like physical sex traits, which are engendered. Besides that, like I'm confused if you're talking about any other trait that exists.
Well, what about
assuming like we're not counting physical sex, their gender expression is like nothing. It's like null, but their gender identity still leans one way.
What about like phenotypical traits, where they're related?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, like phenotypic traits.
Yeah, the engendering.
I mean that as in
sex traits. Yeah.
Yeah, like so you can say that there's like secondary sexual characteristics can that's one way you can say it. Yeah, there are certain phenotypic appearances, but I don't even want to limit it to that. The point is that there are certain phenotypic appearances that are that don't define sex, that are associated with certain sex, that are also associated with certain genders. Like that's the point. And the only point I'm making here is to just be okay with like, if it is the case on your view that if someone is more peripheral to a given family understanding concept, if someone is more peripheral based, and the only thing that is making them more peripheral is certain physical characteristics, that's okay then. I mean, okay then, fair enough. No crazy implications turn on that. That's all. And it's just the case that these characteristics are not mental, and they're not expressivist. So there are certain non-mental, non-expressivist characteristics that can make one more central versus more peripheral. Does that make sense?
It does, but that's just basically like the engendering of physical sex traits, and the whole point now of being transclusive is to start segregating that from gender, as we did sexuality over the past 50 years.
So I think that would depend on what you mean by sex. So I think that this is going to depend on your definition of sex. So I don't put a lot of stock into defining sex based on simple phenotypic appearances of, like, in terms of the ontic conversation. I don't put a lot of stock into defining sex based on secondary sex characteristics. The definitions I work with on sex are the following. Number one, chromosomal. Number two, gonadic entailed. Number three, certain whether certain sex organs. I'm not talking about any epistemic thing. I'm not talking about analyzing people or anything like that. I'm just talking about what we mean when we talk about the sex of an individual. Because, and the reason for that is because if someone did have secondary sex characteristics, but were producing large gamete, secondary sex characteristics of a male, but had but was producing large gametes and was producing and was able to mother children, it would look crazy to say that they're sexually male. So I mean, when I say the other point, so I consider secondary sex characteristics. Yeah, that's part of like a given definition of sex, but it's like not. I don't put as much stock in that as primary. And then the major thing here is that I'm actually okay with there being some overlap with secondary sex characteristics, like making people more central or peripheral in terms of their gender understanding. Like I think that's okay. Like if what we want to say, here's what I'm not okay with. I wouldn't be okay with that in terms of primary sex characteristics, such as chromosomal or gonadic or gametic entailed or anything like that, because that's like a hard separation I have between gender and sex. But if someone wants to say that, well, by shifting your concept of given individual's gender because of these phenotypic characteristics, because they're associated with secondary sex characteristics, then you're not creating a separation between gender and sex. I would reject that. I think I am creating a separation between gender and sex. I just create that separation at a different plane than someone else might. So the plane I separate it as is through primary sex. Is that making sense?
In a sense, I guess that like insofar as how I'm defining sex nowadays, and I'm still working through this, but it seems to be the case that like I don't know, like you've had a lot of conversations and we've had a lot of conversations about like how biological sex is non-binary variable, that there's more than two sexes, like however you want to slice it. And so for me, I've been trying to read like literature, seeing like, just like what kinds of models people are using to try and allocate what they would define as sex. I mean, like it seems to be the case that like, now we're getting into the point of philosophy where it's like, we're probably looking at, which model is going to provide us the most utility. And I've read a bit of literature talking about how it could be useful to, instead of trying to sex a single organism, to sex individual qualities of an organism, right? That would seem to be the easiest way to get to like justifying like a bimodal distribution. I know that's an argument that a lot of people make, but when you say bimodal distribution, a lot of people wonder like, all right, so what are you exactly saying there? And that's kind of an appeal that we could make. And so like when we're getting into this, so to kind of bring that into the question of like, all right, so how does that relate to gender? Well, I mean, like we kind of observe that in some of the literature, or like we'll just make it super relevant. Like Julia Serrano, for example, talks a little bit about how there's like overlap between like how we might consider like sex, maybe like brain sex, and like how that could interact with someone's like gender, right? And I guess I'm just trying to like, it seems like these are concepts which are very closely related, but which are.
I think I just got it, Riley.
Okay.
Yeah. Here's the okay. It just clicked for me. Thank you for bringing it. Yeah. So okay. So the point here is just that, yes, it's actually okay and it may even be okay for primary sex, to shift some the centricity versus peripherality of gender. That's actually okay and compatible with understanding that sex and gender are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that sex characteristics may shift whether someone is central or peripheral in terms of even if it's a small amount, a given individual's understanding of whether they're a given gender or not, that's still compatible with creating a separation between sex and gender. That's still compatible with recognizing that they're two distinct things. They can overlap with respect to certain domains. They can overlap with respect to certain things, but the fact that two different things overlap with respect to certain things doesn't make them the same thing. And furthermore, there really is no reason to have to have this case to make where sex and gender must have no overlap in any domain whatsoever. Like, well, yeah, it kind of does. Like, I mean, at least I don't see any reason to like insist that that no domain whatsoever within section gender can overlap to any degree. So yeah, I agree with Julia Serrano in what she said there.
Okay. All right, yeah. I guess that was kind of the main thing I was looking at. All right. I feel pretty good. Pixie, did you have any other questions?
Oh, the thing I originally came here for was to draw an analogy to sexual orientation and how it's really like there are these two kind of internal, external, these different domains, and the problem, and this is why like Judith Butler and all them failed before, is forgetting that there are two separate domains, and ideally you want them to kind of reunite. But the idea with LGBT people is that there's like basically the gender and sexuality of LGBT people is kind of broken in half. So like if someone is attracted to men but is like basically living a lie and has a wife, like a beard, is that person gay or not? If a man is in a straight marriage, but
well, the answer would be that they're still gay, right? It's just that they're now forcing themselves into a position where they can't manifest their internal inclinations.
Yeah, so with sexuality, it seems that we describe it on the basis purely of one's attraction and not their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
But with gender, how is that translating?
Yeah, I think it doesn't. So in my view, I think it doesn't translate. I think at least, well, it doesn't translate perfectly. Let me say it like that. So I think there are certain concepts that match on to completely internal characteristics, and I think that for me, at least, my understanding of sexual orientation is really that, because I wouldn't say that. So if you ask me the same question, let's say you have someone who is sexually attracted to men, but was raised in some area where he, has a wife and he has kids and he's staying there for whatever reason. He feels bad, doesn't want to break up the family, et cetera, et cetera. But is genuinely not attracted to his wife and is genuinely not attracted to any woman. It's genuinely attracted to men. Versus someone who is genuinely just attracted to men and is actually having sex with men right now. Now, am I gonna view that one any less gay than the other? And the answer is probably not. I think they both match centrally my understanding of being gay. That doesn't translate the same one-to-one comparison with gender for me. With gender, I don't think I think most of it translates. I think the heaviest weightings are in the internal inclinations. So I think the majority of the weighting, the majority of whatever shifting is happening between peripheral and central are going to come down to mental characteristics. And so if someone is overwhelmingly mentally one way or another, it's going to be very central to me that they're the gender that they are mentally aligned towards. However, there's going to be a little bit of shift in terms of peripherality versus being central. If all else equal, one looks like Blair White and one looks like Giga Chad. So I don't think it completely translates for me. I also think it's okay that it does. Because nothing turns on it.
I think that makes sense to me. I mean, like, we can understand that, like, I don't know if we're going back to, like, family. And also, by the way, because you brought this term up, I'm going to be watching and I'm going to be reading a lot more into, like, prototype theory, Wittgenstein, all that, like, after you leave. Could you explain, like, just so that we're on the same page after the conversation is over, could you explain exactly what you mean when you say, like, family resemblance theory?
Yeah. So things can appear to be similar because of one common shared feature that may appear to be that way due to many shared similar features that may overlap with each other. And it may not be the case that each individual feature exists in all of the objects. So none of those features could be have to be necessary or sufficient. It's just that there's shared overlap in that common domain of those various different features. So, like the chair example we went through, like there's we don't have a perfect understanding of chair, but we have a general idea. There are certain features or characteristics that are shared with virtually every chair that we have come across. So, not all chairs are going to have these characteristics, but every time we encounter the thing we call a chair, we observe a given feature. So we observe whether, it has a thing to sit on. We observe whether we can sit on it. We observe whether it has 4 legs. We observe whether it has 3 or more legs. We observe, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a broad overlap in those features. Now, at the same time, none of those features are going to be necessary or sufficient. It's like something could be a chair with 1 leg. It's possible. If you're really good at balancing, you could sit on a chair with 1 leg.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing is going to be necessary or sufficient. But so this idea is just that the concepts aren't formed by necessary or sufficient criteria. The concepts are formed by when we go about and encounter these things that have shared, common, overlapping features with each other.
Okay.
Another way of, and the way I specifically go about defining gender is going to be a set of cluster concepts. So a cluster concept are going to be a weighting criteria, and the weighting, no individual criteria is going to be necessary nor sufficient. And some things are going to be more weighty than others. Mental characteristics will be more weighty for me. Other non-mental characteristics are going to be less weighty. However, they're going to make some sort of difference in terms of the peripherality versus how central it is in terms of the family resemblance understanding of gender.
Okay. I think that makes sense. It sounds similar. I mean, like that sounds like I understood what you were explaining. I just want to make sure that we were on the same page as the conversation was ending. Okay. Do you have any literature on that I could go over with my stream? Or do you know anyone I could read?
Let me see. I would for let me see. I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has family resemblance, language games and family resemblance under Wittgenstein. Actually, let me link that in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful.
All right, here it is. I'm linking in the stream chat.
Gonna go ahead and pin that. I'm gonna remove a pin because I pin a lot on here. But yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And you may want to start actually even above that section. There's all sorts of complicated. I just realized right below that section there's a more complicated section called rule following in private language. Save that for another stream. That's like a whole can of worms that get really into like a whole bunch of spiderweb can of worms of their own. You can branch out into whole other things. But so I guess there's just a brief section on language games and family resemblance. Let me see if the IEP actually has another entry on family resemblance. Let's see here. Okay, but that's the general idea of family resemblance. So that's one source to look at. I'm sure there are probably others that I'm missing. So if anyone has any good sources, they can add it into the chat as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's very useful. All right, and I'll go over that with my stream.
Yeah, otherwise, for sure. Any other questions, Pixie or Riley?
I think I'm good. Pixie?
All right. Well, hey, listen, it's great being here, and
shout yourself out. Tell the chat we have people watching. Tell them where to follow you and subscribe and all that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let me just put my links here. Let's see. So I'm Avi. I'm a doctor, and I do a lot of. I'm AY's PR guy, and I'm part of the AY Discord Infinity Debaters. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. I have dogs barking in the background. Okay, cool. So
and a proud dog owner.
There you go. And I'm a proud dog owner.
Amazing. Well, hey, thank you so much. It's always great having you on here. Appreciate it. And I found the conversation very useful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I enjoy every conversation I have with you. So for whatever that's worth.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Yeah, likewise. All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Later. Bye.
Bye.